so forth. Well, okay, that's the story that John is going to relate to us in John chapter 12. But what's interesting about Mark is he does not name the woman involved. Okay, so if you take the probable history of this, Mark writes his gospel first. There's this story out there of the woman who broke this flask of ointment over Jesus' head and worshipped him in this way, and other people were indignant. That story is out there. And what John is saying in John chapter 11 is, I want you to know who that woman was. And I want you to know why she worshiped Jesus in that way. So here, all of these decades later, John writes his gospel, and as an eyewitness on this occasion, is filling in details that Mark did not choose to relate. Mark was probably drawing on Peter's information. He had the same information, but Mark's telling a different kind of story. That story has a different function in the Gospel of Mark, and he's not big on naming people, Mark. He's not. He's very careful to tell us where Jesus is. He's not necessarily telling us the names of who Jesus is dealing with. So John is coming along with this supplementary information. And he says in verse 2, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So, verse 3 of John 11, the sisters, Mary and Martha, sent to Jesus, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And notice that emphasis there. The sisters are saying to him, we've got a huge problem here. Lazarus is very sick. And they don't call him Lazarus. They call him he whom you love. This is the thing in the Gospel of John. John refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. And in the next couple of verses, verse 5, John is going to say, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. What he's saying is, and what Mary and Martha are saying to Jesus is, you've got a unique, special connection, bond with Lazarus. Lazarus is an important person to you, and he's sick. And it's very obvious what they want him to do. They want him to do what he has done for hundreds or maybe thousands of others in his ministry. Come and heal him. Leave what you're doing and come into Judea. So there are several problems with that request. The first one is that Judea is a very dangerous place for Jesus generally. Jesus has left Judea several times and has delayed coming back. In John chapter 7, he only goes back secretly, undercover as it were. And that leads to a whole series of events where Jesus is almost killed in John chapter 8. They're getting ready to kill him. And they never recover from their fury at him. So Judea is dangerous, but in particular, Jerusalem is dangerous. And Bethany is only 2 miles from Jerusalem. So you've got this situation where his loved ones, his close friends, are right close to Jerusalem. They want Jesus to come back and heal their brother. But for Jesus to do that is to enter into very real danger and threats against his life. So there are all of those kinds of problems. So if you look at verse 4, you get Jesus' reaction to this message. I don't know how you react when you get a message that someone is ill, who is close to you. My reaction is, well, I want to go. If I can possibly get there, I want to be with this person and pray for them and so forth. Here is Jesus' reaction. When Jesus heard it, verse 4, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." That's a pretty interesting response when your friends are saying, your dear friend Lazarus is sick and he's about to die. So that's the first thing that we note about this. Verse 5, John underlines, as we already said, the fact that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And what I want you to notice is verse 6. So, now what would you expect if the sentence is Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus? So, he got on the bus and he went straight to Bethany so that he could be there in time, right? That's what you expect. Because that's the reasonable inference from the special place that they hold. But the so in verse 6 is not followed by that. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. He stayed away because he loved them. What about that? If he's going to die, how is it loving for Jesus to stay where he is and, in a sense, withhold his presence, his comfort, and his power from his close friends? Well, the answer goes back to verse 4. This illness does not lead to death. In other words, though Lazarus is going to die, that is not going to be the end of this story. I have a plan for his death. And that plan for his death is for the glory of God. And it is so that the Son of God may be glorified through everything that happens, the death and eventually the raising of Lazarus. So the lens that Jesus is looking at this suffering through is the lens of the glory of his Father and his own glory. And he says that's what this illness is about. And so, because he loves Martha and her sister and Lazarus, for the sake of the glory of God and his own glory in their lives, he stays where he is 2 more days. Verse 7. Then, after this, after the 2 days are past, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." Now he decides to go back. And the way John is reporting this is Jesus is not really talking to the disciples about his plans, or he's kind of announcing his plans as he makes his decisions. So he's not consulting them, he's not letting them in on his thinking. He is playing it pretty close to the vest. And all of a sudden he just announces, okay, we're going back to Judea. Well, for his disciples, that is definitely not good news. His disciples, verse 8, said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Well, that's crazy. The last time you went there, so this is that whole series of events where he went in John chapter 7 in secret, ends up teaching, and by the end of chapter 8, they want to kill him, and they're picking up stones to kill him for blasphemy. And that just starts things. He heals a blind man in chapter 9, and that sparks even more controversy. So that by the time the end, chapter 10 ends, the Jewish leaders are so furious with him that their conspiracy to kill him intensifies. Just back up to chapter 10, verse 39. After he says, "The Father is in me and I am in the Father," again they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. So this was a repeated thing. We're going to get him, we're going to kill him, and they just don't succeed in that. Now, who is affected by this? His disciples are watching this develop, and they're saying, look, if the Jews try to kill you, or if they arrest you, what do you think they're going to do to us? They're going to arrest us too. And they're going to beat us, and they're going to throw us out of the synagogue. And in fact, Jesus later in John is going to tell them exactly that. Everything they've done to me, they're going to do to you, because the servant is not above his master. The disciples don't actually need to be told that. They put two and two together, and they say, we're going to get killed too. We don't want to go back to Judea. So they were perfectly happy with this 2-day sojourn, and maybe thinking, well, I know it's tough for Jesus to think about himself and not go back to Judea to help his dear friends. I know that's probably hard for him, but really it's the best thing for everybody. And then when he reverses his decision, they're saying, what are you doing? They only just tried to stone you. So, here is Jesus' response to that. And this is one of these responses that Jesus gives that kind of gives rise to the idea that Jesus is a sort of space cadet. He's just kind of out there, and he says stuff that is just not really related to what's going on in the situation, but he's kind of lost in his thoughts and just sort of talking out of whatever is motivating him at the moment, but not really engaged with the situation. And that's the way Jesus is going to be portrayed in most of the Jesus movies. He's just this kind of philosophical space cadet, and he's just not really engaged with what's happening around him. So let's look at this. Here's his answer to the disciples in their concern about his getting stoned and their getting stoned. Verse 9, Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." Well, okay, what does that have to do with what Jesus just heard from his disciples? They're going to kill you if you go back there. Well, we've mentioned John chapter 9, and it's time to go back there because I want you to see the parallels in this situation where Jesus heals the man born blind and the raising of Lazarus. So go back to John chapter 9. Jesus literally is fleeing, hiding himself because the Jewish leaders have picked up stones and they are on the point of executing him for blasphemy right there on the spot. So he hides himself and exits the temple, chapter 9, verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So you remember this situation from when we studied it before. Here is a situation of suffering. And the disciples want to know, whose fault is this? Why is this happening? Is it because this man sinned, or it was because that his parents sinned? Now look closely at Jesus' answer and compare it with what we just saw in chapter 11. This is 9:3. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." You see the parallel? When he encounters the suffering of the man born blind and is asked, "Why is this going on?" he answers, so that the work of God can be displayed in him. In other words, that God can be glorified by what happens in this man's life. In John 11, when he receives word that Lazarus is sick, he says exactly the same thing. I know the end of this particular illness. This illness is not going to end with the death of Lazarus. All of these events are going to be for the glory of God and for the glory of the Son of God. What John is doing here is he's repeating something for emphasis, that our suffering is permitted as a display of the glory of God and a display of God's power and grace toward us. And that's why the Lord permits these things. So he has already said this in John chapter 9, and he's saying it again in John chapter 11. But look at how Jesus continues in John chapter 9 and verse 4. This is happening to this blind man, that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is what? Day. Because night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. You got this parallel situation here between John 9 and John 11. And Jesus' responses to these situations of suffering are exactly the same. The glory of God and the display of his glory is the primary priority that God has, that Jesus has in suffering. And Jesus is saying, this is the daytime in Israel. The way he puts it in John 11 is, hey, there's 12 hours in a day. And I suppose this is an appropriate study for daylight savings time because Chris asked me when I walked in here, aren't you glad that the daylight is going longer during the day? And as I drug in here, I said, no, I'm not. I want that hour of sleep back. Jesus is saying, look, there's 12 hours in the day. You got some daylight, then you got nighttime. When do you walk around? During the day, when you can see. When the night comes, you go out to walk around, you're going to stumble. And what he's saying here is, we're not here to be cautious, disciples. I know you don't want me to go back into Judea, and I know you don't want to go back into Judea because you know the fury against me that is back there. And you know that that fury is going to be directed at you soon enough. But that's not the priority. The priority is, it's daytime in Israel. And the light is here. I am the light of the world, as he said in John 9, as he was leaving the scene of what might have been his own execution right there. I'm the light of the world. As long as the light is here, we work. Because you can't do any of the work at night. And so he says exactly the same thing here in John chapter 11. And what I'm showing you here is the skillful and intentional way that these Gospels are written. so that John really is making a repeated point here. And you could go to take this point, go all the way back to John chapter 5 and the healing of, I believe, the lame man in John chapter 5 at the pool of Bethesda. Many of the same points are made in exactly the same way right there. And so this is something that John is weaving into his story about Jesus. And the basic point is, look, your suffering, our suffering, is for the glory of God. And that's how Jesus views it. He views difficulty as the occasion for displaying himself and his power and his grace. So that is what he says to his disciples. And then he explains the situation further, although the disciples don't get it. So we're back in John 11 and verse 11. After saying these things, Jesus said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." So one of the great metaphors in the New Testament for death for a Christian is falling asleep. They're not conscious. They're not available right now because they're asleep. And so you can't talk to them. And they have to be awakened in order to resume fellowship with them. But this metaphor, Paul picks this up in his letters of Christians falling asleep. And that is, we die physically, we're not available, we are removed from this life until the resurrection day. And so it's the beginning of this idea in the New Testament that death for the believer is temporary. It's a holding tank. It's a way station. It is not a permanent condition. And so this is kind of the beginning of this teaching. Jesus is actually going to spell this out in so many words later on in the chapter. We'll look at that when he talks to Martha about this. But what he's saying here is, that's Lazarus. He's fallen asleep. They've put him in the tomb. That's a temporary condition. I'm going to go wake him up. Lazarus is going to get woke. And that's how he views it. The disciples don't get it. They don't understand what he's saying. Because one of these moments of comedy in the Gospels, the disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Isn't that good for him to be asleep for a while? Just let him get his rest and he'll be better after that. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died." Now watch what he says here. "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Now let's take that piece by piece. What is the concept of death that the disciples are operating under? It's permanent. It's the end, yeah. There's no coming back from this. A very important thing to keep in mind in reading the New Testament is that the idea of resurrection was very much a minority kind of way out there point of view in the ancient world. We think, oh, the ancient world, all of those people believed in miracles and the supernatural because they didn't have all the science that we have and they aren't as smart as we are. So they believed all of those crazy stories and they believed in the resurrection of the... No, they did not. The Romans didn't believe in it. The Greeks didn't believe in it. Resurrection stories are very much the exception, not the rule. There are get-well stories where you go and sleep in the temple of your god or goddess and you wake up well. There's that kind of thing. But the only kind of death and resurrection stories that you have in Greek mythology, for example, is Dionysus gets chopped up into pieces by, oh, I forget the story. They're all so complicated. Somebody's mad at somebody. Anyway, Dionysus gets killed by Zeus's wife Hera, I believe, because he's someone else's son, and chops him up into pieces. But Dionysus comes back together again and comes back to life again and has this power of going down into Hades, the place of the dead. And he becomes the god of reawakening and all of this kind of stuff. And that's it. That's all you get. Springtime, what you see out there with the blossoms, that's Dionysus at work, according to the Greeks. And among Gentiles, the idea of resurrection from the dead is nonsense, absurd, laughable. Don't even bring it up. It's embarrassing. And that's the response that Paul gets when he brings up the resurrection on Mars Hill in Acts 17. He says God has given proof that this is his man, Jesus, by raising him from the dead. And at that point, the whole meeting is over. They don't want to hear anymore. Now you say, what about the Jews? The resurrection of the dead. I mean, for them, surely they believed in the resurrection of the dead. No. The Pharisees did. The Pharisees were not necessarily the majority party in Israel. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Once you're dead, you're dead. The end. And this affected, obviously, the way Israelites read the Old Testament. And so there, when you look at rabbinical teaching and the traditions, it is a very dicey thing whether anybody believes the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees are different and outliers because they do believe in the resurrection of the dead. So we come at this story thinking, well, they're the disciples. Of course they believe in the resurrection of the dead. Well, okay, maybe. Jesus taught them about the resurrection of the dead. That doesn't mean they believed it. And his point is very much that they don't believe it. Because look, go back to what he says. Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there. For your sake. And this is not just even about Mary and Martha and Lazarus and the glory of God that's going to come out of their life. Now Jesus is saying, for your sake, disciples, I'm glad I wasn't there. Now think about that. That this is Jesus saying, Lazarus came to a point of sickness where he was struggling for life, and then he died. You ever watch anybody struggling for life? Being at somebody's deathbed, watching them breathe or try to breathe. I mean, these are terrible scenes. And Jesus is saying here, I'm glad I wasn't there. Because he's going to go through this, Lazarus is. And he has died. By the way, Jesus has not been informed of this by a natural report, like the way he was informed of his sickness. He just knows this. Lazarus has died. They're going to put him in the tomb. And I have waited. And why did he wait? Not just so that the death would happen, but also that there would be no doubt about it. 3 days in, he's been in the tomb all this time. There is no question. That man is dead. Otherwise, you have that scene from The Princess Bride. He's mostly dead. There's a big difference between dead and mostly dead. Got him some slack. He's been mostly dead all day. You know, it takes him a while to come back from that. That's not what this is. Jesus is this is the total shutdown of everything in the body. Dead, totally dead. And we know now, because of science, how long it takes the body actually to shut down. All of the processes of the body to completely stop. And it takes about that amount of time. So Jesus is saying here, I am allowing Lazarus to go through this for your sake. I'm glad for your sake that Lazarus is going to go through this. This is, if Jesus is not who he says he is, then this is some kind of sadist. This is a cruel person, unless he has the power of life and death. I mean, when C.S. Lewis said Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or who he claimed to be, it was this kind of passage that he was talking about. You can add cruel, sadistic to that list. Now, he is not that. But I don't know any other way to understand this than that Jesus does not see suffering in and of itself as the worst evil in the world. And Jesus does not see death as the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world is the darkness of sin. That is the power of death. And so, obviously, Jesus doesn't see death as the worst thing because he underwent death for us, knowing there is joy on the other side of it. There is new life, eternal life on the other side of it. So that's the perspective that Jesus is coming from. His disciples do not share that perspective. And Jesus tells them flatly, I'm glad that I was not there so that Lazarus will undergo all of this so that you may believe. What he's telling them is, you don't believe right now. I've told you all this stuff. I've taught you this from the scriptures, but you haven't seen it. So you don't believe it. You've got notions in your head, and that's about it. So I'm glad that you get to see this. And this is another of the great themes of the Gospel of John. He is constantly going through the irony of how the disciples knew, they had been taught from the Scriptures, they understood some things, but at the end of it, they just didn't get it. And they didn't get it until Jesus himself rose from the dead. And even after that, they didn't get it, as we're going to see on Easter. They only got it when they received the Holy Spirit from Jesus. And so this is another part of another theme in the Gospel of John about the unbelief and ignorance of the disciples. So Jesus tells them this. Now here's Thomas's reaction to this. Thomas, the skeptic, Thomas is the guy who won't believe later that Jesus rose from the dead unless he has all the evidence right in front of him. I'm going to put my hands on the scars on his hands and put my hand in his thigh where I saw that in his side, rather, where I saw the spear go in. Unless I do that, I will not believe that he is the one who died. And I won't believe that he rose again. That's this guy. And Thomas's reaction to what Jesus says is to say to everybody else, "Oh, let us go also, that we may die with him." There's nothing else left for us. We're all going to die. We're going to go into Judea and they're going to kill us. Because they're going to kill us. This time, they're going to get him. And that tells you a lot about the perspective of the disciples on the ministry of Jesus, on the purposes of Jesus, and their state of mind at this point in Jesus' ministry. So, with that, we're going to leave the story there and maybe just have a bit of discussion or questions. Jeff, take it away. Got a microphone right behind you. Well, okay.
I guess I have a quick comment and then I have a question.
Yeah.
The comment would be, could it not be said that during a time of sickness, people would not tend to flock to that location? It would be after the death that the family and many, many people would come to see the body. And over that period of that 4 days, given that Jesus didn't do anything and waste any miracle, that when he went, one of the reasons could have been that there were going to be a multitude there to witness the miracle.
Yeah, that is, if that's not the practice, maybe lots of people came around in time of sickness. I don't know about that, but the way John reports this in John 11 is with a heavy emphasis on all the people who were there to comfort Mary and Martha.
And then a quick question. When he tells the disciples, now I'm not saying I believe this, I'm saying there are people that could believe this. When he tells his disciples that, for your sake, I'm glad that I wasn't there, couldn't it be inferred that if he was there, he wouldn't have allowed him to die in the first place? Was a possibility. And if that's the case, is he making a statement like, well, I wouldn't have been able to resist myself, or you guys would have talked me into it in the first place?
Yeah, it does sort of raise questions about is Jesus just kind of overcome by compassion, and to where he does these miracles because he can't help himself. That wouldn't be the right way to take this, because what Jesus says in John 5, here in this same gospel, is I don't do any miracles that the Father doesn't show me. So he basically says, I can do nothing on my own, and what my Father shows me to do, that's what I do, and that's all that I do.
Yeah, I didn't believe that, but I just wanted to figure that out.
But he is saying here, I think it is reasonable to take this as his own expression of compassion. If I were there, yeah, I would heal him. Now, the other odd thing about this is that Jesus actually doesn't have to be there. And he's made this point elsewhere. The Roman centurion has made this point, and he's made this point to the synagogue ruler, who I believe his daughter was sick, and Jesus gets delayed, and a servant comes and says, your daughter's already died. Don't worry about Jesus coming, and so forth. And Jesus has made this point many times, that he does not have to be on site in order to perform the miracles. He's got command over these things. So whichever way you look at it, Jesus is restraining that ability to heal. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Darren?
Yes, in John 11, there are three very distinct things about faith here: limited faith, fundamental faith, and unlimited faith. Is that correct?
Where do you see that?
Well, in the teachings at the mission, David had brought that up, and we've kind of been going through this, and I was just curious if you agreed with that, the faith thing with Mary and Martha and Lazarus.
Well, I don't know where David would take that, but here's what I do see. No one in John chapter 11 has enough faith. Mary and Martha don't have enough faith. And we're going to see next week the faith that Martha does have. And it's very important. She says something that is just jaw-dropping about Jesus. And it is important that John puts that confession in Martha's mouth and not in Peter's mouth or his own mouth. This is coming from a woman here, and that we tend to lose sight of that. But even so, it's quite clear that she does not yet get it, who Jesus is. So Jesus is going to do this miracle with Lazarus on the insufficient faith of Martha. Mary is totally devastated. She won't even go out and meet Jesus. And, when we get into that conversation, I don't think she actually says anything to him except, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So that is exactly the same misconception that other people had, that Jesus the healer has to actually be on the job site in order to do the job. So her faith isn't sufficient, and she's too devastated even to acknowledge what Martha has acknowledged. So here is Jesus doing this miracle on the basis of nobody's sufficient faith. And I think that's really the point. Is his intention to move his disciples toward greater faith? Absolutely. But even though we move toward greater faith, it's never this kind of automatic kind of thing, and none of the grace of God for us is measured against how much faith we have. So not knowing, and particularly where I'm sure it's fine what David is saying, and it's hard to go wrong with this chapter, but I just want you to understand that this issue of faith is a very important one. We're not talking about whether your faith is total or any of those kinds of things. It won't be. Yeah, David? Darren, I hand the mic right behind you. There you go. Thank you.
I just wonder if you had any insights, because sometimes Jesus would spit and make mud and put it on people's eyes, or go get the coin out of the fish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is he just being creative, or just showing that he has mastered everything, or?
It's a very good question, because but what becomes clear is he has no standard procedure for healing people. So I think one of the things we kind of need to take away from that is anybody who thinks they know the standard procedure for healing people and the magic words, as it were. And so you do this, and you do it this way, and then the person will be healed if you believe enough. I mean, this is a lot what they teach up in Bethel at Reading when they want to train people to do this. And apparently Jesus needed their training, because he could never figure out how he was going to do it. Sometimes he does it with mud, sometimes he does it without being there at all, sometimes he does it by spitting on his hands, and sometimes he does it by sticking his fingers in a guy's ears. I mean, it's just all over the map. He's got no method.
Maybe
He
that's
is
part
the
of the
method.
magic of faith, though, is that you have to follow that trail. Like you're saying, there is no recipe. You have to be in touch with God. Because like you said, a lot of times God almost gave him an insight of what was going to happen ahead at that time. Not maybe years in advance, but maybe just moments in advance.
It may have been moments in advance in Jesus' case, but yes, his point overall is, I, Jesus, am the method. And he's going to say that to Martha. I am the resurrection and the life. This is not some event that I kind of use the force and make happen. I am the event. And that is really his point. So back to Darren's question about faith. It's not a question of how much faith or how little. It's just this one question. Is he Messiah, the Son of God, who has life in himself and has the right to forgive sins or not? If he is those things, that is what we call faith. How much of that have you got? I don't know. How much I have varies. But if it's in methods and all of that stuff, forget it. I don't know any way that you would be able to nail that down. Yes, Brandon.
I know that Lazarus is in a parable like we talked about last time, but is this the only time that this Lazarus is mentioned in the Bible?
That's a good question. This passage is the main time that Lazarus is mentioned. There may be other mentions of him, but as we said when we were talking about the parable with the beggar named Lazarus, that's a fictional character, that's not this guy. I'd have to track this down whether Lazarus is mentioned in another place. Okay. Good discussion. What we will do next time is continue on through John chapter 11 and go into some of these conversations that Jesus has with first Martha and then Mary. For now, let's pray. Lord Jesus, we ask that you would send us from this place with your grace and power upon us, that we would know deeply who you are, and that we would go with your glory upon us. In particular, we ask that you would give us patience and endurance under the things that we suffer, that you would give us a conviction that everything we suffer is for your glory, and that your glory and our good will emerge from all of these trials. And we ask you to give us that conviction and the eyes to see it and receive the healing from it when your good grace comes upon us at the right time. We are humbling ourselves before you. We pray you will raise us up at the proper time. We pray it in your name and for your sake. Amen. Good. See you next week.